Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of June 2024, and I was able to get through 37 books this month, and partially that was because I had vacation that I took from work, and that allowed me to read a little bit more. But without further ado, let's dive into what I was able to read. The first book that I read was the second book in the Boys of Tommen series called Keeping 13 by Chloe Walsh. I have talked about this series in other videos, but basically it is a teen romance series. The first two books are about the romance between a girl in high school and her boyfriend, who is a rugby player, and this takes place in Ireland. And I was pleasantly surprised by how sucked in I was. The first two books are like 1,200 pages. They're about 600 pages apiece. And I listened to them on audio. They were wonderful. The first book ends on a cliffhanger, so I immediately wanted to dive into book two. And I will be definitely continuing on with this series in the future. Next up, I read in pretty quick succession the three books in the Summer Trilogy by Jenny Han. The first one is called The Summer I Turned Pretty. The second book is It's Not Summer Without You. And the third book is We'll Always Have Summer. And this is basically about a love triangle between a teenage girl and two brothers. And she kind of grows up with them. They have this like summer beach house, and they basically kind of grow up together in their young years and their teen years. And she kind of goes back and forth between these two boys. This has been adapted into, I think, a television show with several seasons. So I anticipate I'll probably watch that at some point. I will say that this did feel a little bit manufactured for me, I guess, in terms of like how the relationships were coming together, and especially the ending. It was believable, but I wasn't like, I don't know, rooting for any particular character. So I would say that this trilogy for me was kind of like a 3 out of 5 stars. Like, it was fine, it was interesting, but it wasn't really giving me anything in particular that I felt like other books that I rate like 4 or 5 stars kind of wow me, and I wasn't super wowed by this trilogy. Okay, then I picked up a book called The Reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. And Holly Jackson is the author of the series A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, which I really enjoyed. And this is a standalone about a girl whose mother disappears when she's very young. She's actually with her when she disappears, but she can't remember anything because of the age she was at the time. And then her mother comes back like 16 years later, and there's all of this kind of like backstory about what happened to her and like where she's been. And I don't want to go into too much detail because there's a lot of reveals that happen, throughout this book. I really enjoyed this. I was completely sucked in. I think I listened to it in like 2 sittings with my audiobook. So I would highly, highly recommend that one. Okay, then I picked up Emily Henry's book, Funny Story. And this is her latest romance novel. And basically, this is about kind of a woman who breaks up with her fiance, or rather is like broken up with, because he realizes that he's in love with his childhood best friend. Then the boyfriend of the childhood best friend and the woman who was broken up with become roommates, and then they begin to have a romance. I enjoy Emily Henry's books. I will say that this is one that I wouldn't put at the top of my list of books that I really, really enjoyed by her. The ones that I would put more at the top, I really enjoyed Book Lovers. That's one about kind of like 2 people who decide to switch genres and write books in different genres. They're both writers. But I enjoyed it. And I think if you're looking for kind of like a fun, like summer romance, this is a solid one to add to your list. Then I read a book called Experiments in Reflection by Letitia Britos Cavagnaro. This is one of the books in a series by people who are, I think, either teaching or coming out of the Stanford Design School or D School. And I've read a couple books in this series now. I will say that I love books on reflection, so I was happy to pick this up. I didn't feel like I took a ton away from it, probably because I do a lot of reflection and a lot of journaling and that kind of thing. But I think if you're just getting started with this topic, it would be something kind of interesting to take a look at. Okay, then I picked up a book called Wait For It. This is a backlist book by Mariana Zapata. I have been working through her backlist because I enjoy her books so much. And one of the things that Mariana Zapata does so well is she kind of surrounds her main characters with these very fun side characters. And this is basically a book about a woman who, because of some circumstances in her family, takes in 2 of her young nephews and is raising them as like her children. And she ends up in a romance with her neighbor who gets kind of embroiled in like coaching the kids' soccer team, and like there's other things that they kind of have connections around. And she is basically trying to kind of like come into her own adulthood while she's also realizing what it means to kind of parent these young kids. I really like this. Of course, I will continue to read Mariana Zapata books until I've read all of the backlist. Then I read a book called Your Brain's Not Broken. This is by Tamara Rosier, and it's a subtitled Strategies for Navigating Your Emotions and Life with ADHD. I've been doing a side project on researching neurodiversity for a new product that I'm working on for my business. And so there are many books on neurodiversity that you'll see cropping up in my videos. This one I found to be really helpful. I mean, I think books that have kind of an overview and then very specific strategies of how to kind of work with different elements of neurodiversity are very interesting to me. So one that I would recommend. All right, then I picked up a book called The Retreat by Mark Edwards. This is one of my Alphabet Challenge books for the month. And I think this book had great vibes for like reading it in the fall. It is about a man who goes to a writer's retreat with a woman who's kind of renting out her home. And the woman who's renting out her home had a missing child. And her partner, her husband, also dies as part of like when the child goes missing. Basically, they think that she drowned, and he goes to try to help her, and he drowns. And it's just kind of this like interesting, twisty story. Like there's some really fun things here. You have to kind of suspend like your expectations of reality a little bit. I mean, it's definitely not paranormal, but there are other elements of it that are a little bit not realistic, but I thought it was super fun. So that's one I would recommend picking up maybe for the fall. Then I read a book called The Real Work on the Mystery of Mastery by Adam Gopnik. Now, this is a book that I had originally put on my Alphabet Challenge list, but then I realized I don't actually own it. It was like a library book that it just like showed up in my library even though I'd returned it, but I still wanted to read it. So I ended up keeping it on my list, and then I added another R book later, which I'll talk about. But this was a book that I'm intrigued by the premise of this book about the concept of mastery and like and performance, and like I'm always kind of interested in that topic. This book talked a lot about magicians, which is fine. I'm not super interested in that topic, and so I felt like there were elements of this book where I was honestly kind of bored because I was like, okay, like this isn't necessarily something that I really care all that much about. So if you are interested in magicians, you could definitely pick up this book. Okay, then I read a book called The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. This is a book that is strange. Like there's a lot of elements to it that it's kind of like a puzzle that you're trying to figure out. This is also very true of the other book I've read by this author. And I think in my first video, when I was introducing the books for this month, I hadn't thought that I'd read this author before, but then I realized he was the one who wrote, I think it's like The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle or something like that. I'm probably getting the title slightly wrong. But I had read that, and it's also very puzzly. Like it's also very kind of interesting. This is basically about people who are like the end of the world is like ticking down, and there's been this crime and a murder, and they're kind of trying to solve this particular murder. So if you're interested in kind of like apocalyptic, twisty, puzzly books, this is one that I would recommend. I will say that there were elements of it, and I felt this way about his other book too. It's kind of hard to follow. I mean, you have to be really paying attention. So this is a book that like I would go into it knowing you need to give it your attention. It's not something to kind of like read in the background. Okay, then I picked up Real Self-Care by Pooja Lakshman. And this is a book that basically is about kind of going beyond surface level self-care and thinking about it in a deeper way. I will say that the author's backstory, which I will not go into in a ton of detail other than to say she was kind of a member of a cult for a period of time, and she talks about this in the book. That was very interesting to kind of see how she came into like her lens of like how she's viewing self-care. So that was something that I would just like give as like, there's like a little bonus there. It's kind of interesting that she has this backstory. And I appreciated this book. I appreciate anything that goes on a little bit of a deeper dive and not just kind of a surface level with this topic. So it's one that I would recommend. Then I picked up a book called Unmasking Autism. This is by Devon Price. And one of the things I really appreciated about this book is Devon Price talks about the intersectionality between autism and like queer and transgender identities, which are, there's quite a bit of overlap between those communities. And I think a lot of people may not be familiar with that or aware of that. And so Devon Price talks about kind of that intersectionality approach, and also their own experience of autism and being diagnosed as autistic, I believe as an adult. And so one that I would recommend, especially if you're interested in that kind of intersectionality angle. Then I read The River by Peter Heller. This is a book that on Goodreads is not scored very well. It was a 5-star read for me. So I would just say I'm not entirely sure why people do not think this book is incredible. It's basically the story of these 2 college-age boys who are going on this kind of like canoe trip, and they're very into the outdoors. And so they are like fishing on their own, you know, they have a lot of experience in the outdoors. And while they're on this canoe trip, they start to realize that there is this wildfire. And they're trying to kind of like race the fire a little bit to get to where they need to go so that they'll be safe. And while they're traveling, they come across, you know, a couple different groups of people. And one of them is this couple, and they meet them later on down the river. This is not spoiler. This is kind of like the plot of the book. And the woman is missing. And the guy, like they're trying to figure out what happened to this woman because they run into the man and he's alone and he's not with the woman anymore. And they know there's this wildfire and they're like trying to figure out what to do. And so they end up like going to look for this woman. I will stop there in terms of the plot because there's all kinds of things that happen after that. One of the things that I think Peter Heller does incredibly well is he has this kind of like simple, like almost like stripped down way of writing that's very clear. And it reminds me a little bit of like Natalie Goldberg's writing, if you're familiar with Natalie Goldberg. Natalie Goldberg is a writing teacher and she like writes these memoirs and she has this very kind of like straightforward way of writing that's very beautiful. And Peter Heller is kind of that same way. And I loved this book. I was like super interested in like where it was going. There were some definite twists towards the end. It had the plot elements. It had like this kind of nature writing. So I'm like kind of confused as to why people aren't rating this higher, but for me, that was a 5-star read. Then I picked up Only and Forever. This is the 7th book in the Bergman Brothers series by Chloe Leese. I wanted to finish this series because this is the last book. This is a series about interconnected siblings who all have different romances. And it's a wonderful series. It also has wonderful representation of disability and neurodiversity, and there are different kind of elements of that happening in every book and in every romance. This is the story of the final brother, and he is known for kind of like loving reading romance novels and like incorporating them into his life in different ways. And this is his romance story. So I won't go into a ton of detail other than to say I would definitely start at the beginning of this series. The first book is actually one of my absolute favorites in this series. And Chloe Leese, you know, is a wonderful author, and I actually read something else by her a little bit later in the month. Okay, then I read the second book in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. This is called The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King by Carissa Broadbent. I had read the first book in this series called The Serpent and the Wings of Night, I think last month or maybe the month before. And it's basically a story about vampires. Like it's a vampire setting. And also there's like these trials. And I love the first book. This is something I talked about where it was really hyped and I was a little concerned about like how it was going to go. I feel like the first book just kind of like, it surprised me by how much I enjoyed it. The second book was a solid addition. I'm not actually sure. I think there might be even more books in this series moving forward. Let me see. There's at least a third book that's coming out this November. So this book to me was a solid like addition to a series. I think oftentimes a second book can be like a slight letdown just because like you love the first book and then the second book is just like, I don't want to say it's like filler, but it's like getting you to whatever's happening in the third book if it's a trilogy. So I enjoyed this one, and I think this is a solid series if you're interested in kind of the like vampire trial elements that I've talked about. Then I picked up another Chloe Liese. I picked up a book that I've actually read before, but I wanted to read it again. It is the first book in the Wilmot series, the Wilmot Sisters series, called Two Wrongs Make a Right. And these are books that Chloe Liese has like rewritten Shakespeare narratives and used like kind of the plot of Shakespeare plays to layer into these romances. And so this particular book is about two sisters who are twins, and one of the sisters is kind of like there's more neurodiversity representation in this book as well, and she's kind of just like doing her own thing. Like, she's not necessarily interested in having a romance. She came out of a romance that was not a great experience for her, and then she meets this guy at a party, and he and she are kind of, it's like an enemies to lovers. Like they're not really getting along, but everybody's trying to like get them to hook up together and to date. And so they decide to pretend date just to kind of like get everybody off their backs. And I had read this book before, and I remember at the time like not being wowed by it. And I thought, I don't know if it was the book or if it was me. And so I decided to read it again because there's a second book in this series that I want to continue on. And then the author has also written a third book in this series. So I wanted to remind myself of all the characters so I could move on to the next book in the series. And I would say that this was a situation when it was definitely me and not the book, because when I read it again, I really enjoyed it. And so I'm excited to pick up the next book in the series, which is about, there's actually 3 sisters. And so it's about one of the other sisters that's in this trio. Next, I picked up The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a book that people absolutely love, and I just had never gotten to it. Taylor Jenkins Reid, I've read several of the books in her backlist and have enjoyed many of them. She is very well known for Daisy Jones and the Six, which was made into a television show. And there's other books, I think, in her backlist. One True Loves was also made into a film. And so this book I had just wanted to get to eventually. It is about kind of a Hollywood starlet and her many relationships over time. And I don't want to give away spoilers because there are things that happen that I don't know are like on the back of the book cover. Like, it's not necessarily something you know is coming. So I'm going to leave it at that. But just say that I really enjoyed this. The audio was phenomenal. I enjoyed the way that the book was structured, which is basically the Hollywood starlet is telling her story to like a journalist who's going to be publishing the story. And so she's kind of going through all these different relationships she's had over time. I thought it was great. Next up, I read a book called May Tomorrow Be Awake on Poetry, Autism, and Our Neurodiverse Future by Chris Martin. This is a book about a man who basically supports autistic youth primarily, but other people as well, in writing poetry, and especially people who are nonverbal. And this was such a fascinating book. He includes poetry from different people that he's worked with, and just the way that this book is written, like the craft of how he kind of brings a bunch of different elements together, it was really well done. This was something that I just found the topic to be really interesting, and also kind of how he structured the book to be really interesting. And I loved seeing kind of the stories of how he's worked with all these different people. So highly recommend that one if that's a topic of interest to you. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I swapped out an R book, and what I swapped it out for was a book called The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. Kate Quinn writes historical fiction, and this is a book about women who are code breakers in World War II. It has a great kind of mystery element to it, because from the very beginning of the book, you learn that one of the characters is basically in like an insane asylum, and you don't know why, and she's trying to get out because she's not really insane. And so there's this like element of like mystery and kind of this really interesting component of like what's going on, you know, with this particular character. Like many other Kate Quinn books, I really enjoyed this. I got sucked in. I think she's just an incredible, like her, I don't read a ton of literary fiction, but she's an author that I go back to again and again. Okay, then I read the Shadow and Bone trilogy. This was one that I've been trying to get to for a long time. The first book is called Shadow and Bone. The second book is called Siege and Storm. And then the third book, which I read a little bit later in the month, is called Ruin and Rising. And this is a trilogy that Leigh Bardugo is kind of building out what she calls the Grishaverse, and it's like this magical system, you know, that she's created, and there's a couple different series that she writes that are in this Grishaverse. The other one that I read is the Six of Crows duology, which I loved. It's like this heist, you know, storyline, and I really, really enjoyed that. I found myself really enjoying Shadow and Bone. Like, I was like blown away by the first book. I thought it was really interesting. And it's basically about these two young children who realize they're kind of orphaned, and then they kind of begin to realize that they have these kinds of powers. And I don't want to go into like a ton of detail, but there's kind of, it's a little bit of like a coming of age in the first book. And then they're starting to kind of understand, their relationship with each other. It's a boy and a girl, and they kind of have a little bit of like, there's like some romantic tension there. And then also their relationship to these powers. I feel like of the 3 books in the trilogy, the first one was my favorite, followed by the third book, followed by the second book. I know that's kind of a common, you know, thing where like you might like the first one or the third book better. But I feel like in this one, the first book just felt a lot stronger to me than the other 2. And maybe it was just because I was being introduced to a lot of things that I found to be really interesting. But altogether, a solid trilogy. I will continue to read Leigh Bardugo. I think she's just really creative, and I find her books really interesting. Then I picked up a book called Death Under a Little Sky by Stig Abel. I think this might actually be a debut book for this author. And this was a book that to me felt like kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with like the TV show Midsomer Murders, but it was kind of like Midsomer Murders, where it was like a little bit of like a cozy mystery. And it's basically about like this guy who's in a very small town, and they find these bones and they're trying to figure out what's going on with them. And I just like kind of sunk into the story, and like I just found it to be very cozy. Like, I mean, it's hard to describe exactly why. I think part of it is like the small town setting. It's a little bit of like a closed door mystery, and that like there's only so many people who are like involved in this small town, and like who can be like suspects, you know, as you're kind of moving forward. But I listened to this mostly in one setting, and I would definitely pick up something by this author again if they had more books. Next, I picked up a book called The Return of Ellie Black. This is by Emiko Jean. This is another author I've not read before. I'm not sure if this is a debut or not. But this is a book that is about a teenager who goes missing, and then she comes back. And she doesn't want to talk about where she was or what happened to her, but we know that she was like held by a man. And the book is basically kind of like uncovering like different layers of what happened, you know, with this particular kidnapping basically. And I'm pausing because there's a lot I can't talk about because it will go into spoilers. So I guess I'll just stop there. But I liked it a lot. There's a kind of a detective who's at the center of the story who her own sister has also gone missing. And so she has kind of this backstory of this cold case. And then she's trying to kind of like work with this new victim and like understand what happened. So this was a really solid mystery and had some nice twists and turns at the end. So I can highly recommend it. Then I picked up a book called Leather and Lark. This is the second book in the Ruinous Love trilogy by Brynne Weaver. And this is basically a series of books about serial killers who find romance. That's kind of the easiest way to describe it. The first one I think got a lot of praise because it just kind of stuck out. Like it's a little bit more creative. It's basically about 2 serial killers who find each other. And then the second book is kind of the same. It's about the best friend of the female serial killer and the brother of the male character in the first book. So there's like these interconnected characters. I will say that just as kind of a little bit of a warning, if this is something you watch out for, this book is, and the first book, they're pretty spicy. So if you are looking for something that's a little more of like a closed door romance or something that is not super spicy, I just put that out there because of the books I read, I would put this, you know, much higher on the spicy scale. And of course, if you're interested in that, you might want to pick this up. But I really like these stories. I mean, it's basically, I like romances about people who are a little bit damaged and they're like kind of trying to find their person. And this definitely falls into that category. Then I picked up the third book in the Jack and Jill series called Dawn of Forever by Jewel Ann. And this is a series that has books that follow after this, but I would say the first 3 books kind of work as a trilogy in themselves because it's basically about 2 adult siblings who go into kind of like a witness protection program after their parents are killed. And we don't know why their parents were killed. We don't know like all of the circumstances that led up to that. And basically you find out all of those circumstances throughout these 3 books. And there is a massive unveiling of like the circumstances in book 3. So you get a lot of satisfaction of like what exactly was happening with these siblings by the time you get to book 3. This is one of those trilogies that, or series that I feel like is a little bit of like a genre mashup. Like there's romance, there's mystery, there's a little bit of comedy in it as well. And so I found it to be kind of unique. So I would recommend that too. Then I read Resilience for Dummies by Eva Selhub. I just want to say, I feel like the For Dummies books get kind of a bad rap. Like they're actually quite good. If you're looking for an entry level introduction to a topic, you know, usually they're organized in a way that's actually really helpful in terms of understanding kind of basics. And this one I would say is no different. It was broken down into like very small chunks and pieces, which by the end got a little bit fatiguing because I felt like it was like you were just getting these kind of like listicles about things. But overall, I actually found this book to be quite good. And I enjoyed the different strategies and kind of the topics that they talked about related to resilience. Then I picked up a book called Darling Girls by Sally Hepworth. I've read, I think, a couple of books by Sally Hepworth in the past. This is, I would say, a kind of mystery thriller. It is about 3 adult women who were raised in the same foster home by a woman. And they had kind of, I think you could say like abusive experiences in this foster home. And as adults, they get called by a detective because they have found bones under the house of this foster home. And they're trying to understand what happened to obviously the bones that are buried underneath this house. And so all the girls that are now adult women kind of come back together and go back to this town where they were fostered. And then they are like meeting with these detectives and kind of reconnecting with each other. I thought this book, like I had heard from people that there was like a big twist at the end. I didn't feel like it was a massive twist at the end. It was interesting. I definitely liked the interplay between like the 3 adult women. They all are a bit damaged and like trying to figure out, you know, how to move on into their adult lives in ways that are maybe healthier than what they experienced as children. Solid thriller if you're looking for a mystery or a thriller read. Then I read Rebecca Schiller's 1,000 Ways to Pay Attention. This is a memoir about how Rebecca Schiller was diagnosed with advanced ADHD as an adult. And by advanced, we eventually find out, I don't feel like this is a spoiler, that she's like in the 99th percentile of ADHD. Like she is, has extremely challenging circumstances around this disorder. And it's basically how she kind of comes to have her diagnosis. It's also the story of like how she and her family moved to basically like a homestead and they're kind of homesteading. Really interesting. I liked the perspective that she was offering, and I really like memoirs that talk about like the lived experience of neurodiversity, and so this was a solid entry. Next, I picked up Catherine Cowell's book, Fragile Sanctuary. This is the first book in her Sparrow Falls series, which is a new series that she's writing. I think the second book doesn't come out for like another month or so. And this is a book that is about connected siblings who are kind of like found families. Some of them are like fostered together in a house. And one of the siblings, who's the primary character of this book, a female main character, was in a house fire when she was a child. And this is what leads to her being fostered in this family. And she is coming back to the house as an adult, and she's wanting to like rebuild the house and live there and kind of reclaim, you know, this house. And there is a man who is helping her to fix up the house, and he's a former FBI profiler who's kind of running away from kind of his past experience as a profiler, and they begin to have kind of a tentative romance. this is a book that in the beginning I was like, I am not sure who all these characters are. Like there's a lot of things kind of thrown at you, but throughout the book you kind of start to understand this family and how all these people are connected. And I ended up really liking it. I think this is a character that's mentioned in the last series that I read by Catherine Cowles, which I'm not gonna be able to remember the series name, but this FBI profiler is like a side character in that series. And so it was nice to kind of hear his backstory and see where that went. Okay, then I read pretty much back to back Justin Cronin's The Passage trilogy. This is made up of 3 books, The Passage, The 12, and The City of Mirrors. This is, there's a lot that I can't say just because the further you go into these books, and they're all relatively long, I would say this series altogether is maybe 1700 pages. When you start the series, basically there's this kind of like government science project that is gone wrong, and it's created basically like a race of kind of like vampires or zombies or like something in the middle, and it creates this kind of apocalyptic situation. And there is a young girl who is part of the science experiment, and you realize that she has the potential to kind of like fix the situation. You're not entirely sure how or like what's going on. And then of course there's like this band of people who've survived. They're not zombie vampires, like they're just normal humans, and they're trying to live in this world where there are all of these like predators basically. The first book is the story of basically like how this begins to happen. The second book continues on a couple different pathways and trajectories. Again, it's hard to kind of talk about. The third book, I will just say, it gets wrapped up in such an interesting way. Like it like made it all completely worth it, even though sometimes I felt like these books could have been edited down just a smidge. Like they're very long. And then there's also this element that's included in the books at different points where it's like a future academic conference that's like reflecting back on this time, and they've like studied this time. Such a fascinating addition to like this concept of this trilogy. So I'm really glad I read these back to back. This is a book series that has a lot of detail in it, and if I had not read them back to back, I would have completely forgotten like a lot of the details and characters, because there are a lot of characters, there are a lot of different like strands that you're trying to pay attention to. So I would recommend, if you're going to go into this, it's a commitment, I would try to read them close to each other if you can. Okay, then at the tail end of the month, I picked up a couple of books. I was on vacation from work, and I was doing kind of like a mini business retreat. And so the first book is one called Business Made Simple. This is by Donald Miller. Donald Miller has written a bunch of books that are kind of like simplifying business terms. I think this book is great for people who are just starting out or who have like a little bit of experience under their belt. I've been running a business now for about 8 years, and so I would say there wasn't like a ton of things in here that was like brand new to me, but it was nice to get kind of a refresher and to see how he was kind of laying out the topics in this particular book. And then the second book that I picked up is one that I'm considering for a new program that I'm going to be running, and it's called 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And this is one that I saw, around for a long time. Like a lot of people were kind of talking about it, recommending it. I think it was like a New York Times bestseller, but I hadn't had a chance to get to it yet. And I really did enjoy this book. One of the things that the author really talks about is we've kind of set ourselves up with like impossibilities around time. Like we expect that we're gonna be able to do a lot more than we can. We expect that we have like all the time in the world, kind of to do these things. And the title is basically like, you only have a certain amount of time. So you need to be like prioritizing and picking what you want to do. So I found that to be really interesting. It was a nice way to wrap up the month to read that book. So those are the 37 books that I was able to get through in the month of June 2024. And I hope you'll stay tuned to see what I'm hoping to read in this next month. There are plenty of really interesting books that are on my to be read pile for the month of July. Until the next video, happy reading.